I think I'm saying that we struggle all our lives to answer it. That it's the struggle that is important. That's what helps us to define our place in the universe.
This is Beverly, Dr. Beverly, Dr. Beverly Crusher. Honest.
Forceful.
Trusting.
Brilliant.
Strong.
And adventurous.
And this is Crusher Convo.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Crusher Convo, where we are crushing the conversation one episode at a time. I am your host, Jessie, and I am super excited because I'm going to be discussing Time's Arrow and the CODA series. And I decided to do this ahead of one of the authors of CODA, which is Dayton Ward. His book comes out on May 21st, his new book, which is set in Star Trek The Next Generation and DS9. So I really wanted to discuss this because Time's Arrow is one of those two-parters that are not necessarily the greatest two-parters, I guess you can say. It's not horrible, but it almost just kind of, the finale for season 5, it was good. It was all about Data and trying to figure out how he died, and then he gets sent back to, I think it was 1898, I believe it was, or something like that. And of course, the premiere is the rest of the gang coming back and trying to get him back, and we see Clemens, who is supposed to be, oh my gosh, I can't think of his name right now. Famous author, Mark Twain. There we go. Whew, took that a second. I do watch Lower Decks, I swear. So that just took a little second for me. But I think it's a good episode, but it did have some plot holes in it that never really was discussed. And I think this is where CODA comes in and really took something that was just kind of there and gone and never discussed again and really elevate it to the point of where you're like, oh my gosh, this could have totally happened, because they did have these aliens called the Devidians, who were pretty nasty little creatures who went back on Earth, basically sucked the energy out of humans to survive, right? Kind of getting Ronan vibes out of this, because that's what he was doing with Beverly's family. He was sucking their energy in order to survive. So this kind of led to that. So maybe Ronan was a Devidian. I don't know. He was an anaphasic energy. That's all I know. But I thought it would be just really interesting to discuss this. This was the first books that I got to read as a Star Trek fan, because, I just barely started watching it in 2022. And I was told by a lot of my friends at the time to read these books prior to watching Star Trek Picard. And it was just because of how well Beverly Crusher was written. And they were not wrong. I've read more books since then. These books have been fascinating. And of course, they've set in this expanded universe between Nemesis up to Picard, right? And I think they did a brilliant job. And we'll discuss more as I kind of deep dive into CODA. But it was, of course, the side of Beverly Crusher and Picard and all that stuff that we wish we got to see on screen. Okay. So I think, I just think it was just a really good series, and it definitely deserves the recognition. But yeah, I think we would just go ahead and jump right in. So I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. All right, so here, of course, a screen cap from Time's Arrow. This is actually from part 2, nearing the end of their adventure. I think what's interesting about this is, of course, they got to do something different, right? They got to go back into the 19th century and dress up and just, not have to be on a starship and all that kind of stuff, right? So I think it was just very interesting how the story went. Like I said, it wasn't bad or anything. It just kind of was quick and didn't really go anywhere later on. At least not for, that particular story was open and closed pretty well. They found that Data's head was in a cave for 500 years. How did he land there? And then turn of events comes through. And then, of course, they figure it out, and the circle was complete. And then that was just because of how Data's head went there. They were supposed to go back. And so it was a really good open and closed part. The only two things that I feel was a plot hole was Guinan and Picard's story, and then, of course, the Devidians. Okay, so the reason why I say about Guinan and Picard, we've never really known about their story. I think one of the things is that we knew that they knew each other. We knew that they met. I kind of want to see in a personal matter. And in some cases, I can kind of see why people think this. I don't think this is true, but I could see why there might have been a romantic history between the two, or they just really, really cared for each other for whatever reason that we just don't know about. Now, for Guinan, this was her first meeting with Picard, that she met him in the 19th century. For Picard, it's kind of like a Doctor Who. It's a timey-wimey, wibby-wobbly situation, kind of like River Song and the Doctor, where he's meeting her in the middle of him already knowing her. So it's, of course, a little confusing, but you kind of figure it out. But then you just don't understand, when did he meet her? Why is it so special? Stuff like that. That I feel like it could have been explored more, in that sense. But I do want to mention a little bit of this. And the reason why I popped up the Nema Check It Out part is because I have a couple little snippets from his book that I'm going to read. And, it doesn't mention the Devidians very much, which again, I feel like is a plot hole. But this one definitely brings up how they kind of decided to deal with the story. So in part 1, I'm going to, this little section that Larry has here. He says, surprisingly, Time's Arrow marked the first real-time trekking for this crew, holodeck and Q fantasies aside. At first, Piller said he wanted to bring the crew to the 1990s, but he discarded that idea because it had been done in Star Trek IV. The staff discussed the 1960s and the 1930s before deciding on the turn of the century. Piller said that before Joe Menosky went on sabbatical, he left notes on the concluding segment that would open TNG's 6th season come fall. I do want to highlight a little bit. I did hear that the 1960s portion was that Data stopped the assassination of John F. Kennedy. I believe that was their idea, but then they scrapped it. And I think it's really cool that Joe did leave notes for them in order to do the 6th season premiere, because I remember when they were doing Best of Both Worlds, they weren't sure how it was going to play out. And so, that's why Best of Both Worlds Part 1 is just so powerful, and oh my gosh, and you don't know what's happening. And then Part 2 is just like done, right? And that was just because they didn't have it written and they just had to do it as quickly as they can. So it was good that he put in notes, because it does mesh well together, right? In the second part, it says here, anytime you deal with with time, you're going to have complexities that are hard to grasp, Piller said. But if you really look at that closely, I think we got them all nicely stitched. Taylor, who had modeled her mix of historical fact and fiction on the writings of E.L. Doctorow, was satisfied with the outcome, but regretted how much the demanding writing distracted her from settling in with the staff right after hiatus. It would be the last cliffhanger conclusion, whose writing would be off until after hiatus, an exciting but very scary custom she was determined to end. Regretting that Moore wasn't done with the 1980s period, Ron Moore said that one of the ideas dropped due to time and budget would have picked up the time travel crew in various jobs after several months, centered around their meeting place at a wharfside cafe run by Picard, where the running joke was how bad his food was. And I wonder if that's why the whole running joke about how bad his wine is, and that's what was in Picard. Maybe that's a little homage. Not really sure, but I thought that was kind of cool. But like I said, the other plot hole to this was the fact that we did not learn more about the Devidians or the aftermath of it, right? So here are these creatures, like I said, sucking the energy out of humans in order to survive. It's very scary for them. They don't know what's going on. They destroy the planet and they stop whatever they were doing in the 19th century. But then that was kind of it. I think at the time, maybe they just thought, well, we'll just discuss of how, they were destroyed. Okay. Which is almost kind of against Star Trek's morals because they're not one to destroy other species or other living beings. Maybe in this sense, because there was a danger aspect, it wouldn't have, been good for them to do that. But I'm not really sure. It just would have been good to know more about later on, which is what CODA did. So, like I said, Time Zero is not one of those greatest two-parters. It's not even one of those top favorites when it comes to a finale and a premiere in between a season, but it's not a bad episode or episodes. I think it's just one of those ideas that could have gone more. I think Ron's idea of when it would start and they were there for several months, that kind of changes a person, right? So even when they would go back to the starship, when they go back to the Enterprise, their mindset's a little different because they just had to survive how we do. They had to work and make money and do all this stuff. And Beverly would have been working in the hospital and seeing stuff that she had only heard about in textbooks. I think it would have been really nice to see them in that situation. Again, this was not serialized. This was all episodic. So the moment that, the premiere was over, on to episode 2. So what I feel that Dayton, James, and David did with CODA was really grasp those ideas, those loopholes, those what ifs into a very good story in the midst of what they had to do. Okay. So I guess we would just go ahead and jump right into that one. And that's, of course, we're going to be talking about CODA. So there was 3 books total. There was Moments Asunder, which was from Dayton Ward. There was The Ashes of Tomorrow, which was from James Swallow. And then Oblivion's Gate, which was from David Mack. I got the privilege to talk to Dayton in Salt Lake last year. Extremely nice guy. Absolutely had a blast talking with him. And what was great is that when I was talking to him about it, I had told him I had a podcast and it was about Beverly Crusher and everything. And I had said, you wrote Beverly perfectly. And he was like, oh, thank goodness. Because they're writers and they're writing what they feel is going to be great for these stories. But you never know. There's going to be some readers that are not going to be agreeing with how they approach a character. Which happens a lot in books, which is fine. Every writer has their different perception of a character or a show that they're writing for. But there's just something about, especially these 3, them back to back, it was almost like they were all writing these 3 stories together, which kind of they were. And I'll get into that in a second. But one of the things was I told him it's one of the best series that I've ever read. I think they did wonderfully with it. And he was very pleased with that. And honestly, I don't think I've known anyone who has said anything bad about this series. That's how good it is. So if you have not read these books, I highly, highly recommend it, especially about how important it is for Star Trek Picard. The reason why I say that is because they had written all these books from, like I said, after Nemesis up until this point. And these books basically depicted what happened to these characters after what happened on Nemesis. And of course, we all know that Troy and Riker got married, and in the books they had a daughter that they named Natasha after Natasha Yar. And then, of course, Picard and Beverly get married. They have a son named Rene. Worf becomes his XO. Data, of course, has passed on, but is brought back, and so is his daughter Lul. I believe Geordi was still the chief engineer. Picard was still the captain of the Enterprise. It was Riker that became an admiral. So there was a lot of stuff that was going on in these series of books that just showed their lives after Nemesis. And, that's what an expanding universe does. It just tells you a continuing story of after the fact, which many franchises does, as we know. Star Wars has a huge expanded universe that completely got wiped out when they decided to do The Force Awakens. This is basically what happened with the Star Trek series. Everything got erased because they decided to do Star Trek Picard. The difference is we got an ending to those stories versus what happened with Star Wars. With Star Wars, Mara Jade, the twins, all of it, Ben, I did like the homage because JJ had it Ben Solo, but in the books it was Ben Skywalker. So, there's all these different aspects to how this goes down. I liked how they ended it, and I liked that we got an ending, and it makes sense, right? So and this is actually in the book, and I forgot to bring my book. I have an autographed book from Dayton I purchased there at Salt Lake, and one of the things is that he had heard from Kristen Beyer, who was part of Star Trek Picard, that they were going to be doing this. And it's like, oh no, what about our stories? So as he's learning a little bit more about it, he then later on talks to James and David about creating this series about obliterating the timeline is basically what they're going to do. You could do that in Star Trek. That's basically what Wesley is as a traveler. There's different timelines, time and space, all that stuff, timey-wimey, wibbly-wobbly stuff, right? So they said they were together for like a year, pinpointing what exactly is going to happen, what are going to be the villain of the story, of why, and this. This is where the Devidians come in. I think it was brilliant that they brought back a one-time villain that we only saw for 2.5 seconds and cause havoc. And it's not even just havoc, it's complete mass chaos in these books. David's was kind of the start of something had happened, right? And they were trying to figure out what it was. James's book is the getting everything together so then they could, because they had a plan to try and stop the Devidians and how that was approached. And then in book 3, of course, David was the mass chaos and obliterating the timeline. And I don't want to say that they lost in a way, but in a sense it was a loss because they had to lose the timeline. That was a big theme throughout the books was they don't want to lose their timeline, right? Picard doesn't want to lose Beverly as his wife. They don't want to lose their children and, things like that. But in this case, in order to finally stop the Devidians, they had to make that sacrifice, right? So I think what was great, especially when you start off, there's a lot of Beverly in it because it has to do with Picard, it has to do with their son Renee, and it has to do with Wesley. Wesley's a big part of this series, which I think is amazing because he is a traveler, time and space. There's many different versions of him trying to stop the Devidians. Kind of funny as I was rereading these books and then, listening to them. I have Audible and I was listening to them at work, and I just watched X-Men 97, so spoiler alert, but Cable going back, multiple versions trying to stop Bastion and Apocalypse and all that stuff of how everything ends. That's kind of what I felt like with Wesley. And one of the biggest parts of the book was the fact that Beverly loses Wesley not only once, but twice. And then, so again, spoilers if you haven't read the books, something happens to Renee. One of the things about the Devidians is that they created these avatars, and the Nagas, I believe is what they were called. That was supposed to be that snake-like creature. Okay. So anytime they were touched or something, people would be obliterated. They would just poof, gone. It was a whole Marvel Thanos snap of the finger, just poof. And something happened in one where Renee almost got touched, but he didn't. And what it did is that it grew him up. Okay. Because what it is that they're not just poof dying. They're literally getting old, like rapidly. So because his was like a brush, or he was barely touched, or it was like I think the material of the avatar touched him, and he became like 19, 20 years of age, but his mind was still a 6-year-old boy. So here's Beverly and Picard having to deal with what happened to their son, Renee. Beverly witnessed a very old Wesley, 300 years old, I believe it was, die on her table. And of course, she's trying to be strong and very scientific, and to the point of like, this is what we found, this. But of course, Dayton is really writing the emotions. Even though we're only reading it on a page, we could see Beverly just numb and devastated and doesn't even know how to process her emotions, while she also has to be a doctor and a scientist at the same time. And Picard feeling helpless in this moment because he wishes he could take this pain away from her, and he can't, right? So this was a really good section of the story of how everything progressed. Now, a different Wesley pops up, and he's like, I'm alive. Now, this is a 50-year-old Wesley. So basically, a Will Wheaton, right? Because Will is going to be 52, 53 this year. I'm very bad at ages, so sorry. And so he comes and says, like, basically, I'm being recruited by my other self to try and stop this. Doctor Who vibes, because that's same thing that the Doctor has done before. And as much as they try to figure out the proper way, it was almost like, oh, well, they created this. The whole reason this timeline is being and everyone's dying is because they made a mistake. And this was another excellent point from First Contact. So it's not even Nemesis, but First Contact, when the Borg had gone back in time to try and assimilate and stop the warp drive of Earth meeting the Vulcans. That was one of their like, oh, we set this whole course in motion when we stopped it. And of course, because different timelines are on top of each other, this is just how it worked, because the Borg come nearing the end of book 2 into book 3, and they're part of the problem, right? Because of course the Borg are going to try and take advantage of the situation. We get to see Mirror Universe characters. We get to see DS9, Voyager, all of it, right? Very heavily, though, it's TNG and DS9, because that's what the books were. They do start to kill main characters pretty quickly. Ezri Dax was the first to die. She was a captain. So you got to see the emotions. And of course, Cisco comes back. So you see the emotions of losing Dax, because that was his old man, right? You hear about with his son, and his son has a wife, and you hear O'Brien and Keiko, Bashir, like they're all there. They're all there. But one by one, we start to see this start to crack and people start dying. And even characters that were created for these series start to pass away. So if you got to read these books back from Nemesis time, so I believe Nemesis was 2002, if you were reading these books back then, you got to know these characters that they created of how they met after. It's kind of like a Rafi for us from Picard, right? They're dying in these books, and it's horrible deaths. And so Nog dies. I think he was the next one to go. And very emotional turmoil, right? We're just seeing these as they're trying to figure out to stop these Devidians, they're losing everyone that they love, which is probably why nearing the end, it was like, we've already lost so much that hopefully obliterating this timeline would be better, right? Because everyone would come back, hopefully. So another thing too, and like I said, bringing back the Borg, which we get in Picard, can never escape the Borg. But I do like how it was much different this time, and you see that turmoil from Picard. But you see Beverly just being a badass and not wanting to leave Picard behind, not wanting to leave Wesley or Renee. It's just, one of those things that this is what I actually wanted to mention. Riker's story was huge because you sense something is very wrong with him. He's definitely not himself. And he was having dreams about, and this was from another book where another version of the Enterprise that didn't have Picard, like there was an overlap between the two. And they ended up getting destroyed. So these Devidians were not just destroying this one prime timeline that we knew of after the Nemesis. They were destroying every timeline, okay, in order to survive. They didn't care what they were doing. They were just like, we are going to survive, and we're going to suck the life of not only just humans, but timelines were just a big feast for them. So as what you're starting to see these characters fracture, some characters are dying, some are doing a conspiracy theory. A big one for Tom Paris and B'Elanna. Tuvok was even in there. But what was so good about Beverly being very highlighted in this, especially because of Wesley, and we already discussed about Wesley dying and coming back, what happened to Renee. She was still a doctor. She was still a scientist, but she was definitely a wife and a mother, and that was her top priority. I think what was cool, too, about the Riker situation, and I keep jumping back and forth because I keep remembering little snippets. This other Riker, there was they called it temporal multiple personality disorder. So another Riker who tried to stop the Devidians, and they failed. Somehow his mind went into this Riker, and he took over to try and stop them in any way possible to not make the same mistakes that they did. What was cool, and this is because these books were overlapping over when Picard was airing, was that this Riker had a son named Thad and a daughter named Kestra. So it is the Riker from the Picard era. And the one that gets destroyed was the one that they had a child but lost in a miscarriage, and then they had Natasha. I really liked how that just intertwined with each other. It just made it where you're like, oh, that happened. And okay, this makes sense. This could totally work with this. So another thing too is, as this was very hard for Beverly during this time because she sees her friend Troy going through this. She sees her husband going through a lot. Her friends are dying. And, one of the biggest scares for all of them is the stuff they were about to lose, was that life that they worked so hard, the life that we wanted for Crusher. And it was so devastating to see that all just be eliminated, right? Like I told Dayton, this was stuff we wish we saw on screen. This is stuff that we had hoped for Picard and Crusher. And I know him as a writer, and even David, and James, like that they all just knew that Picard and Crusher should have been together, right? And so that's why they wrote that in their stories. So to see that just get destroyed was really hard to listen to. And of course, in book 3, all hell breaks loose. Like there's just everything is collapsing. Everything, like I said, people are dying. It is just done. And again, Beverly witnesses the death, a very horrific death, mind you, of Wesley. I believe he got burned alive. Like it was just in a holographic image. So very Star Wars, right? And even though he died, Renee was like, no, Mom, listen, he's still there, because since Wesley was a traveler, he was a part of the universe, is basically what I think they were trying to say. But his mortal body was gone. I remember with the Borg, especially the Borg Queen, she was trying to get into Picard's head and bring back Locutus and this kind of stuff. Well, torture him because she was pissed, right? After what happened in First Contact. And so, but this is the part of Beverly where you're like, she pulled a Molly Weasley moment of get away from, you stay away from my daughter, where she just starts blasting into the Borg Queen to save Picard's life, which is a side of Beverly we all knew, but we only got snippets of it in TNG, barely any of it in the movies. We luckily got it in Picard, but they were fighting for their lives, that even Renee, who had the mind of a 6-year-old, but a body of a 20-year-old, holding a phaser and shooting at these creatures. And it is just absolutely devastating for what they were going through at this time. I do remember a section where the Mirror Picard was watching, his name was Luke, was watching Renee, and he ended up saving Renee's life because he was like, I never had a family, I never got married. And that's almost kind of reminiscent of what we're getting with Star Trek Picard. Of course, Picard had a child, he just didn't know about it at the time. So they're intertwining all these different things. And like I said, there's so many timelines that could happen. People could say this is canon, this is not, whatever. But I think what works so well with this is that this could totally be canon. It worked totally with what we're seeing right now with Star Trek Picard, Star Trek Strange New Worlds, Lower Decks, whatever you want to say, right? Because it just works in that order perfectly. As much as they were afraid of what they were going to lose or what was going to happen when they destroyed the timeline in order to save the universe, the one thing that was heartbreaking and beautiful at the same time was that everyone's dying. It's really just like Renee, Beverly, and Picard are the last ones. Renee is holding them. He has the device to stop it. Beverly says, do it. They kiss. Presses the button, right? That was how they ended that timeline. And I thought it was beautifully done, because that's how we see Picard and Crusher. They have this undenying love for each other that we just never, ever, ever got to see. And it was so sad that we never got to see it, because there could have been, well, they wrote it and this was exactly how we wanted to see it on screen. But what was cool about the end of the series is that they were putting out different timelines that we saw. Like, what if Picard didn't enter Starfleet and he was an archaeologist? Or what if he didn't go far and he was that junior grade scientist that we saw in Tapestry? What if he didn't get killed by, or lose his heart from the Nausicaans? What if he did marry Beverly Crusher? What if they did divorce, like in All Good Things? They were just hitting all different timelines. What if Picard's mom was still alive? What if she died the way she did? Like all of this stuff. And so then it's like they're looping through different timelines to see which, like, spin a wheel and see which one sticks. And of course, it ends up ending with Picard in the Vineyard, retired as an admiral, with no Beverly, no Renee, never married her. This is where this one comes in of where Star Trek Picard happens. And that's where it's heartbreaking because we're like, this is the timeline we got. But of course, we did get Beverly back. They do have a son. His name's not Renee. It's Jack. They did have a relationship. It just, they never got married. They never had that life together. They were separated for over 20 years. So it's more of this Greek tragedy than it is anything else than we would have had hoped for, that we were getting with the stories that, Dayton and James and David and every other author out there were putting for us fans, because not only are they writers, but they're fans of the show themselves, right? So it was greatly appreciated of how they wrote these stories. I'm sad that those stories no longer are, in my opinion, no longer canon, but they can be. It's a different timeline, right? Those whole series of books are canon in a different timeline. That timeline just got erased by these horrible creatures called the Devidians. That was just a small little nugget that was mentioned in The Next Generation. So I think that came full circle. And I think it was done beautifully. I think I'm more just sad of how everything happened with Beverly. It's almost like one gut punched for another for her character, because that's just how it went for her. Like, no matter how she tried to have happiness in her life, and she did, she had lots of happiness in her life, it was taken from her, right? She lost her parents. She lost her husband. She ended up losing Wesley. She ended up losing Picard, right? And I think, those things are all still canon since they started that timeline kind of after First Contact and Nemesis and stuff. So anything before that, basically the whole series of TNG, all that was still accurate. That still stayed the same. But it wasn't, Beverly ended up, when that timeline was obliterated and Picard ended up alone, Beverly ended up alone with a little boy, right? So you get to just feel the sadness of her being alone with her son, lost her career. The life that she created was gone, and she was doing everything to protect her child. And so again, it's just like one of those really, really sad things. But I think the CODA series really did Beverly justice. It was something that we all knew was in her. It was something we all wish we got to see. The different series of books that are out there that depict Beverly Crusher. I mean, some are just little snippets of her in there, so it's not very Beverly heavy. But even those show, yeah, that's Bev. We just didn't get to see it in The Next Generation. So I'm glad we have those books. It's totally different versus what we have with Star Wars Expanded Universe. They never existed, right? Those books never existed. Take them out of your mind. Done. This one, we at least know that there is, in some little, timeline out of time and space in the Traveler's universe, there is a timeline where Beverly and Picard were married, had a son, Renee, and they were happy. And that's what we want for these characters. And I'm glad that that's part of it. And of course, there's other timelines where they got married and divorced and didn't have kids. And then there's other timelines where they didn't get together at all. And, there's even timelines with even Jack Crusher, older Jack, husband Jack, that no matter what, Beverly and Jack were never together in any of the timelines because either one of them died. Either Jack died, Beverly died, or they were divorced because Wesley died. Like there was always this tragedy with their story as well. But it was always a part of the story to guide another one, right? So that's even sad in its sense, because we know how much Beverly loved Jack, and you should watch the very first episode of this season where I'm talking about the story that was never told between Beverly and Jack. But like I said, one of the biggest reasons why I wanted to talk about CODA was not just about how great it is. And again, if you have not read the books, so sorry I spoiled this for you, but they are fantastic. Definitely a must read. And I think that Dayton, James, and David really took the time and put a lot of heart. Like you could tell they, no stone unturned, completely just put those little matching every little section and checking off little points here and just making sure that it worked and it made sense. And even with certain things where it's like obliterating a timeline or time and space, you can make up anything and it should make sense when it comes to stuff like this, right? But they really took the time for it to make sense, right? I think that was just wonderful. And I'm so happy that I got to thank Dayton in person for that, because it was just wonderfully done. And of course, one of those reasons that I decided to do this was because of his new book that's coming out. So this is his new book. It's coming out May 21st. It's called Pliable Truths. And I have a little, snippet here of what it's about. So in 2369, which is about season 6 era of TNG, says shortly after Starfleet thwarts a Cardassian attack on a Federation star system, the Cardassian government orders to end to its 50-year occupation of the planet Bajor. As a result, a newly installed Bajoran government requests immediate assistance from the Federation to mediate how to withdraw, will proceed, and what recompense, if any, Bajorans are owed from their brutal oppressors. Captain Jean-Luc Picard is ordered by Starfleet Command to oversee these tense negotiations on Tokornor, the massive Cardassian space station still orbiting Bajor, even as he still deals with his own recent trauma as a prisoner held and tortured by the Cardassian interrogator. So, of course, this is the start of DS9, obviously, and he is part of those negotiations, which we know had happened. But yeah, this was literally around the time where he just did the whole 4 lights situation, right? So I think this is going to be really good. The cover has Picard and Garrick on it. And so Garrick has probably a big part of this story. I can't wait to read it. I already pre-ordered it. I am super, super excited. I know it's going to be really, really good. But there was also another book that came out this year from one of the authors. And of course, that is going to be Firewall from David Mack. Now, this was released back in February 27th. And this one was about 2 years after Voyager returned from the Delta Quadrant. 7 of 9 finds herself rejected for a position in Starfleet and instead finds a new home with the interstellar rogue law enforcement corps known as the Fennis Rangers. The Rangers seem like an ordeal fit for 7, but to embrace this new destiny, she must leave behind all she's ever known and risk losing the most important thing in her life, her friendship with Admiral Catherine Janeway. Again, I have not read the book yet, but I hear it is fantastic. So this is basically 7 after Voyager, right before Picard, right? So this is what we're seeing. I really wanted to throw those out there because, they're still continuing their stories and it fits within the timelines and it fits within canon of what we're seeing on these shows. And it's filling in those little holes that, I'm waiting. Someone, please write a book about Beverly's 20 years away. Really want to know what happened in those 20 years. Like she said, a lot happened in 20 years. We want to know what happened. We want to know what her life was like without Picard and taking care of Jack and doing illegal stuff, Beverly was doing illegal stuff here and there. So I really, really hope that comes about, like how we got Seven's story. I think that is going to be important, and I hope we get to see that. But yeah, I really wanted to throw that out there because I feel like those are important, and I'm super excited. So yeah, I loved re-listening to these books. Like I said, I have Audible, and that's what I was doing. And there was a lot to the stories where I was like, oh, that happened. I forgot. Again, they did Beverly justice when at a time of the show, they didn't really do her justice very often, right? So it was nice to see in this sense of, proving us fans right. This is just how Beverly was. And even it fits perfectly with how she was in Star Trek Picard. Terry is a huge Star Trek fan. He knows these stories, he knows these characters, and that's why season 3 was so good. But yeah, it was definitely fun to listen. Again, go read them. Fantastic. I do want to thank Dayton for his time when I met him in Salt Lake, and all the stories he told me between, them trying to get those books out are just fascinating. And of course, with James and David, also fantastic writers. Go look them up, read their books. You will not be disappointed. If you are a Star Trek fan, these books are definitely top notch for sure. But that's just how it is. So redhead alert, guys. I do want to let you know that next week you are going to get a bonus episode. So this is not live per se. It's already been pre-recorded, but I was with my lovely friend and podcaster, Abby from First Flight Podcast, where she is deep diving the show of Star Trek Enterprise with her co-host, Chris from Shelf Nerds. And we decided to do the best Beverly Crusher outfits. And we had so much fun. This was such a blast. Abby is a fantastic, fantastic person. Absolutely love her to death. I'm super excited about that. But yeah, I think you guys are in for a treat. And there will be another live the following week on the 31st, where I will be joined by Josh from Twist My Arm podcast, where we are going to be discussing Beverly Crusher in the Star Wars world. And I'm super excited about that. But yeah, please hit us up next week as we talk about the best outfits of Beverly. I hope you guys enjoyed this little video that I did today about CODA and Times Arrow. I want to thank, of course, Larry and his book, Larry Nemechek. Always a pleasure. Everyone who has been supporting Crusher Combo since I've been back. I really appreciate you guys so much. But yeah, so if you guys have any thoughts or questions, please hit me up, drop a comment. You can see me on Instagram and on Threads at Crusher Combo. I will be trying to get the website back up. It's not going to be it's going to be pretty simple stuff, but at least we'll have all my information on there. And you'll be able to see the recent videos and stuff that I post on Instagram. I still will be doing my videos on there as well. So, you'll probably be seeing another vid drop here soon. I have a couple songs that I'm interested in and making videos from. So yeah, I can't wait. But anyways, guys, thank you so much. Until next time.
Crusher out.